Australia can date its homegrown navy back to 1859, with the creation of a navy known as the Australia Squadron. Even so, 5 of the 6 Australian colonies still retained their own naval forces. However, that changed on March 1, 1901, when the Commonwealth Naval Force was formed, just 2 months after the country became a united federation. The new navy only received royal patronage in July 1911, but from its conception it would be known as the Royal Australian Navy, or RAN for short. As in many other countries, the 1920s saw Australia investing less in its navy. It started with the political apathy after World War I and culminated with the consequences of the Great Depression that kicked off in 1929. However, by the early 1930s, the Australian government was becoming increasingly concerned about Japanese imperialist ambitions and that country's aggressive expansionist policies. Japan had already expanded its span to 3,000 kilometers or 1,900 miles to the south. The Japanese were on the brink of taking over the Dutch East Indies with their huge oil and mineral deposits, as well as various islands in the South Pacific. All of that was right on Australia's doorstep. Furthermore, by the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, was far larger in scale in the Pacific than that of Britain's Royal Navy. Unsurprisingly, the Australians were freaked out by this. Also worth mentioning is that Australia still had its infamous White Australia policy in place, which meant keeping all non-whites out of the country. This rabidly racist policy, which was only gradually dismantled after World War II, only fueled the fear that Australia had for Japan. Those fears ran very, very deep. This is a country, after all, that only recognized Aborigines as full citizens in 1967. By 1938, it was becoming increasingly clear that war in Europe was almost inevitable. Japan was furiously rattling its sabers in Asia. Like many other countries, Australia rapidly ramped up its military expenditure, especially in its navy. This was unsurprising given Australia's enormous coastline, not to mention its vulnerable location in the southern Pacific and Indian Oceans. With the outbreak of war in September 1939, Australia's naval mobilization was well underway. Its fleet at that time included 2 heavy cruisers, HMAS Australia and Canberra, both of which had 8 8-inch guns, and 3 modified light cruisers, namely HMAS Hobart, Perth, and Sydney, which in turn had 8 6-inch guns on board. Other vessels included an older cruiser, HMAS Adelaide, and 4 sloops, HMAS Parramatta, Swan, Warrego, and Yarra. As you can tell, all Australian naval vessels are named after Australian cities, towns, and rivers, and the designation HMAS refers to His Majesty's Australian ship. As for the rest of the RAN's fleet in late 1939, it included 3 anti-submarine auxiliaries, 6 auxiliary minesweepers, 1 mine layer, 12 combat store ships, 3 repair ships, 10 net-laying ships, 9 survey ships, 2 cable repair ships, and 6 tugs, as well as a further 75 auxiliary patrol boats, 33 motor launches, and 20 air-sea rescue vessels. There were more than 50 other miscellaneous vessels used by the RAN. It wasn't a huge navy, but it wasn't minor by any means. The focus of World War II in 1939 and 1940 was almost exclusively in the European theater and its environs, which included the Mediterranean region, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf. And so it was that Australia started out by sending its ships to those theaters of war, as well as the Indian Ocean and coast of West Africa. Its main focus, though, would be the RAN destroyer flotilla in the Mediterranean, as essentially ordered by the British. The fleet was based at the island of Malta and would be mocked by the German Admiralty and referred to as the Iron Scrap Flotilla. The Germans derided the Australian presence in the Mediterranean with their admittedly outdated fleet of ships, but the Aussies did their bit in assisting the Allies, which meant taking on the might of the Nazi German and fascist Italian navies in the Mediterranean. The Axis powers were later augmented by France's Marine Nationale when that country surrendered to Germany in mid-1940, courtesy of the collaborationist Vichy puppet government put in place by Germany. The RAN was made to focus its operations on the Italian Navy, and in particular its large merchant navy that was very active throughout the Mediterranean. An early success occurred on June 27, 1940, when the Italian submarine Console Generale Liuzzi was attacked south of the Greek island of Crete by the Australian destroyer HMAS Voyager, together with 4 British destroyers HMS Dainty, Ilex, Decoy, and Defender. The Italian crew were eventually forced to scuttle their submarine. There was more Australian success the very next day, June 28, 1940, when the 7th Cruiser Squadron had a battle with an Italian convoy on its way to Egypt. The Italian destroyer Espero was pummeled with 10 direct hits at short distances by HMAS Sydney, even as the Australian ship was forced to dodge torpedoes being fired by the Italian destroyer. The Italian destroyer would eventually sink, with its survivors taken on board HMAS Sydney. Just over a week later, on July 7th, an Allied fleet departed from Alexandria in Egypt to Malta. On the way, the Allies spotted an Italian fleet some 500 miles or just over 1,000 kilometers in the distance. The Allied fleet hunted down the Italians' convoy, and by the afternoon of July 9, 1940, the Battle of Calabria was furiously underway, although called the Battle of Punto Stilo by the Italians. On the Allied side, there were HMAS Sydney and 4 other Australian vessels, as well as an aircraft carrier and 19 other vessels belonging to the Royal Navy. The Italians had 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 16 destroyers on their side. The battle may have been impressive in scale, but it proved indecisive, with 3 damaged ships on both sides and both fleets returning back to their respective bases in Malta and Italy. In fact, it could be argued that it was a partial victory for Italy, given that all Italian merchant ships were able to get past the battle unscathed. The Italians certainly treated it as their victory. The battle did mark the first full-scale confrontation between Italy's Regia Marina and the Allies' Mediterranean fleet. It was also one of the largest naval battles that occurred in the Mediterranean during the entire war. There were other successes for the RAN fleet. These included Australian ships successfully bombarding the coast of Dakar in the French colony of Senegal in West Africa on September 23, 1940. This resulted in 2 destroyers belonging to Vichy, France, being unable to leave port, while another French ship, the Audacieux, was sunk thanks to a volley of 8 torpedoes from Australian ships. Exactly a week later, on September 30th, HMAS Stuart destroyed the Italian submarine Gondar with the help of other Allied ships, forcing the sub to be scuttled. The Italian submarine had been on its way to the port of Tobruk on the coast of Libya, which at the time had been captured by Allied forces. The Australian fleet played a pivotal role in protecting convoys to and from the besieged garrison at Tobruk, although the garrison was captured by German forces in June 1942. However, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in December 1941 that changed everything for the Australian Navy. Now the fighting would be a lot closer to home and even more intense. Australia declared war on Imperial Japan on December 9, 1941, just 2 days after the attacks at Pearl Harbor. The Australians no doubt felt they had no choice, given that Japan and the US would now be at war in Pacific waters. As a result, the ports of Brisbane, Townsville, and Cairns in Queensland were all rapidly expanded in order to accommodate the Allied campaign in the Southwest Pacific. Many of the RAN's larger ships were quickly deployed to protect Australia's extensive coast from possible invasion by the Japanese. After all, at the time, many of them were still being deployed in the Mediterranean, as well as Atlantic and Indian Oceans off Africa. Furthermore, no less than 600-odd small auxiliary civilian vessels were given the task of patrolling Australia's sea lanes and coast. A new British-Australian component of ABDA, an acronym for American, British, Dutch, Australian Naval Forces, was formed. During the few months ABDA was fully operational, Australia would lose both HMAS Voyager and HMAS Armidale, the latter being sunk by the Japanese when trying to land Dutch soldiers off Baitano in the Dutch East Indies, in what is today Timor-Leste or East Timor. Things came to a head when ABDA naval forces were unable to prevent the fall of the Dutch East Indies to the Japanese. After that, major RAN units would be attached to the American-led 7th Fleet, which was formed with its base in Brisbane on March 15, 1943. It would later be known as Task Force 7. For Australia, things really came to a head on May 1, 1942. The Japanese had been assembling an invasion force to capture Port Moresby on the southern coast of Papua New Guinea. That meant the Japanese would be a mere 520 kilometers or just under 325 miles from the northern tip of Australia at Cape York. In their minds, the Australians simply had to mobilize. It was on May 1st that the cruisers HMAS Australia and HMAS Hobart set off to rendezvous in the Coral Sea with 4 American ships, the cruiser USS Chicago and 3 escort destroyers, the USS Perkins, Farragut, and Walk. They would be there to cover the U.S. Carrier Task Force 17, which was headed by the USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, 2 Essex-class aircraft carriers. The Battle of the Coral Sea that ensued was immense. The Allies had 26 vessels in their fleet, while the Japanese boasted 53 vessels in theirs. The numbers may have looked heavily lopsided in favor of the Japanese, but the Allies came off better. They lost 3 ships, with a further one damaged, while the Japanese lost 5 ships and had a further 4 vessels damaged. The Japanese also lost more sailors and airmen in the battle than did the Allies. For both sides, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a critical turning point in the war. It proved to the Allies that superior tactics and air power could win battles in the Pacific. In turn, the battle did a lot of damage to the Imperial Japanese Navy, which until then had been almost invincible in the entire Pacific region. The Americans gained a strategic advantage due to what went down in the Coral Sea, culminating in its massive victory against the Japanese at the Battle of Midway Island just a month later. If the Battle of Midway Island was the beginning of the end for Japan's navy, the Battle of the Coral Sea was its germination. The irony is that the Japanese High Command had already decided prior to the Battle of the Coral Sea to not invade northern Australia. But it didn't matter because for most Australians, the immediate threat of a Japanese invasion was almost surely over. That in itself was a huge morale boost for the armed forces and people of Australia. Even so, the Australian coastline continued to be at threat from the Japanese. One example was when 5 Japanese submarines attacked and even shelled the cities of Sydney and Newcastle in New South Wales, in which HMAS Kootabool was badly damaged and sank. New rules of engagement for convoys between Brisbane and Adelaide had to be quickly drawn up in response to the Japanese attacks. But even tighter convoys and shipping lanes didn't prevent 17 merchant ships being sunk in Australian waters within just a few weeks. RAN ships also played a critical role later in the war during the massive Battle of Leyte between October 23 and 26, 1944. HMAS Australia, Shropshire, Arunta, and Warramunga were all active participants in that battle, along with American ships of the 7th Fleet and combined forces that included those from Mexico and the Philippines. In fact, it was HMAS Australia that was the first Allied ship hit by a Japanese kamikaze fighter plane during the battle. Of course, like any major navy, Australia suffered some big losses during the war. These included the loss of HMAS Parramatta, which sank off Tobruk in Libya on November 27, 1941, with only 23 of the 160 officers and crew on board surviving. On a far greater scale and just a week earlier was the loss of HMAS Sydney. She sank off the West Australian coast on November 19, 1941, when hit by the German raider Cormoran. All 645 men on board HMAS Sydney perished. That news was met with profound grief and even outrage by the Australian public. Early 1942, which the Australians referred to as the RAN's Black Months, saw the loss of no less than 6 Australian ships, namely HMAS Perth, Yarra, Vampire, Canberra, Voyager, and Armidale. And then there was the hospital ship AHS Centaur, which was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine off the coast of Queensland on May 14, 1943. The ship sank in just 3 minutes. Only 64 of the 332 crew and medical personnel on board survived. That too created a lot of consternation in Australia, not to mention even more intense hatred of the enemy. Some authors have estimated that by the end of the war, Australia possibly had the 6th largest, 5th largest, or even 4th largest navy in the world. It had certainly grown during the war, having 39,650 personnel and 337 warships at its peak. Australia's contributions were impressive, too many to cover in just one video. The Allies in both Europe and the Pacific no doubt owe a huge debt of gratitude to the role played by the officers and sailors of the Royal Australian Navy.